In a new age of watchmen, a team of individuals, pooling their talents and abilities, come together to bring analysis, reaction, and comedy to the fold. This is their chronicle. This is Accounting Arc.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the ARC podcast with Liz, Donny, and myself. We've got a doozy of a conversation here today. Don't turn off the dial or change episodes too quickly when I tell you that we're going to be talking about ethics, because it is not going to be what you come to expect with ethics. As we were prepping for this episode, I was sharing, I've been a CPA, I think, for 22 years now. So I've been required to have 4 hours of education a year.
Did you just put a date stamp on your forehead?
I think I did.
You said dial and you said 22 years. I just want to point that out.
Change the dial.
Yes. Well, I'm sure with all the references and us sharing our stories, everybody knows I'm square in the Gen X era. But yeah, so I mean, figure I've had somewhere in the ballpark of 80 to 90 hours of ethics training in my career. And I've had some great presenters, people I know personally, and they've all done a okay job at checking the box for getting ethics training. I can say, however, in that 80 to 90 hours, I have never walked away, inspired with new knowledge or feeling like I have a better grasp on confronting ethical situations. And in fact, I would argue that, generally speaking, I think ethical decisions, the right decision is generally obvious, in my opinion. Making that decision is what makes it hard. So I've not been confronted with even an example of where like the ethical decision is the difficult one is not clear what it is. It's just maybe the implications of that decision, I think, is what makes it hard. So anyway, none of the trainings have resolved that challenge for me. And we're going to talk about, why that is and maybe like how we could better approach ethics training. And I know Liz has some great experience approaching it from a different angle, which is no surprise to any of us. And so I'm excited to get into this conversation and maybe learn something new about ethics.
So to further delineate why you should not turn the dial on us, whatever that means, we're talking about ethics, right? So discussing like how people in our industry are actually speaking about this today, not specifically diving into ethical theory, which is fascinating in and of itself, and we can do that another day, but talking about ethics, right? So as Byron said, most of these ethics presentations are formulaic, right? It's like, okay, we have to talk about independence. We have to talk about making sure that you're making the right ethical decisions. We're giving you kind of a duty ethics framework of it is your duty as a CPA to make sure these bad things don't happen. So here's how we avoid it. And here are some major mess ups that have happened in the past. And here's what's come out of it. And here's the law. And here are the ethical requirements of your profession around those laws. And let's test you on that. So then you get these multiple choice questions that are like, is this an independence violation? And yeah, there's some gray area, but generally speaking, it's not gray. Like you can't audit something you prepared, hands down, right? And that makes sense. It's unethical to like put a stamp of approval on something that you did yourself, right? Like that doesn't work. You need an independent verification. And that's where this whole framework ideology comes from, right? And of course, the debacle that happened of Enron. And if you don't know what that is, please go Google it and then have a wonderful field day understanding why, anyways, well,
It's
that's
not
a rabbit hole we can
required
avoid.
that we take 4 hours of ethics every year.
Yes,
That's right.
You can understand the requirement for the training, and also the trainings need to be rebooted, in my opinion. In my humble, annoying professional opinion, is that we need a reboot and we need something fun. So, we have some friends in this industry, right? And one of them owns a company called Earmark CPE, who partnered, that's Blake Oliver, partnered with Greg Kite, who's a comedian and a CPA, doing CPE. So there's lots of acronyms that can trip up your tongue if you don't watch it. But back to the point of what I'm trying to say, they partnered to do this thing called drunk ethics. And we were just talking about this because it's the first time, well, not the first time, but it's the first major openly, easily accessible time that someone in our industry has taken a stance saying ethics is boring and ethics shouldn't be boring because, quite frankly, it's a fascinating topic. And they put this out there, and I was laughing hysterically because I Googled it right before the episode, right before recording, and this is what it says. Unfortunately, after a single complaint, the authorities have demanded that we remove drunk ethics from our CPE course library because apparently drinking and swearing while talking about ethics is unprofessional. Fortunately, you can now earn CPE for the paid course, Censored Ethics. It's the same material, but we've bleeped out the swearing and alcohol references. So there is still one option that is not mainstream. But I can say that option is still formulaic and talking through these independence issues and not necessarily the underlying foundational ethical theories that drive our profession. That was a mouthful.
I know, I'm just like breathing heavily, just trying to keep up with you.
I had too much coffee today, guys.
This will make it fun.
It's funny that we all mentioned this you started with the independence thing too, because I think that really was the focus, and that does go back, I think, to Enron when we look at independence. But really, it's only auditors, and it's really the audit piece that has that independence requirement. For the rest of us that are in accounting, and even those that are not CPAs, the standard really is objectivity. So are we able to be objective and really advise the client, whether it's an external client or if you're a controller, CFO, internal client, on how to actually make the best decisions? And part of the base of that really comes back to, are we separating ourselves and our personal interests from whoever it is that we're advising and really looking at what's best for their interests? But I think, Liz, you were actually saying you were talking about kind of a broader picture, right, of ethics and how tell us more about that.
I have too many opinions. So I believe that in order for a moral and centered human to make good ethical decisions, we need to philosophically understand ethical frameworks. And I state that from an academic perspective, right? For me personally, if I don't understand the framework and the implications of turning one dial, that's for you, Byron, this way and another this way, and what the output is, then how am I supposed to make a good centered ethical decision? And how do you even consider those issues, right? Like, are there different ways to think about it? And the answer is yes, of course there are. And some of these ethical considerations and these ethical philosophies are dependent on culture, right? We all come from different places, and we all have different foundational belief systems as to what is right and wrong. And that can be very gray in different instances. And I bring up, like, for example, in Japanese culture, the kamikazes were celebrated, absolutely celebrated. They sacrificed their lives for the like country, for their people, for the many. And that is amazing in that culture. In our culture, suicide is not to be celebrated. And that is not considered a sacrifice that is ethical in our perspective. From a Western United States upbringing, I can say I don't believe it's ethical for our government to send anybody to their death purposefully, even if it's for the good of the many. It's a very Machiavellian type ethical consideration, but that's a framework, right? And that's understanding, what is the means to the end, and is the outcome the only thing that matters, or is it the process of getting there that also matters? And so what I believe, is that we need to approach these ethical discussions from a different perspective. And it's not about here's the CPA framework of these are the decisions you can make and here are the rules and the hard, like we have decided this because it is unethical. We are now going to tell you what is unethical. We need to teach it at a higher level, which is here's why it's unethical. Here are the theories and the philosophies around it. Here's what matters in your culture and in other cultures so that you can actually have a full basis to make these decisions and have the ability, like Byron was saying at the beginning, to make the decision correctly instead of just saying, well, I was told this was wrong, so I'm not going to do it.
Right.
You need to understand why.
Right. And I mean, Liz, would you say it's fair to say that we're talking about values, defining values, and that's the framework? Because to me, that's what I think about when approaching ethical dilemmas is my values of being what I define as a good human being. And I'm going to make that decision within that framework of my personal values.
So I think that's where you get into the gray area of morals versus ethics, right? And that is traditionally very difficult for people to define, right? Like morals are right and wrong conduct based on your own values, right? Or based on the values of your profession. That is still a moral issue. Ethics are rules based on like an external system, right? So morals are internal, ethics are external in my definition. Does that make sense?
I'm with you on that. That's because that's kind of the way I think about it too. The fact that what I think is wrong or right, whether it's related to my culture, my religion, my personal philosophies, right? There's a difference between that and sort of what I think Byron is saying is more like the organizational ethics, the organizational values, which determines what the organization that we are firm, whether it's an accounting firm, a regular business, a nonprofit, a governmental entity, what the how I make decisions and what's important to that entity. Compared to also, because Liz, you said the word rules several times, and I think it's an important thing to raise where there's a difference between the rules or the law or the policy. And that gray, I think, occurs when there isn't a rule, policy, or law that says this is wrong or right, compared to what the organization thinks and what I think. Would you agree that's I think is what causes that gray, is when I don't have a clear like this is wrong or this is right, and I got to figure it out.
Right. And I think, morals are developed as a code internally with your personal values. And like Donny said, all of your own culture and your own upbringing and understanding of the world. But ethics are more of a philosophical external thing that exists, right? Like if you look at like the history of ethics, it's always been a history of philosophy and a history of like philosophically, what does this do to the bigger picture, right? And there will be times that, maybe ethics and morals aren't aligning, and that is rare. And I always encourage people to stand by their own moral code as well as an external ethical code. But if there's a situation where those are in conflict, recuse yourself, just walk away. It's not worth it. But I do think that ethical theories and ethical philosophies over like a very long time have changed based on different cultural issues and based on, humanity becoming more human and enlightening and believing that every person has rights. And I think that that's changed the way that ethical theories have been considered holistically. And I bring that up because one of the things I've been trying to do is think about how do you talk about ethics and ethical theory and give people this framework in a way that's relatable, right? Because if you're just talking about philosophy, I don't know how many of you guys have been to philosophy courses, but I find these things fascinating, but they're also terribly boring because they're talking about a philosophy in the abstract, in like the what if, in the, hypothesis of whatever. And you're just kind of sitting there like, what? Like, how does this relate to anything that I would even emotionally relate to? And so, one of the books I read as I was probably a teenager that I thought was really fascinating was a book called The Ethics of Star Trek. I don't know if you guys have actually read this book, but I highly recommend it because it takes ethical philosophy and then it relays it into like different episodes of Star Trek, which of course is ethics at like a government level or a planetary level in that particular case. But it takes these issues that we're dealing with on a day-to-day basis and breaks it down in a way that you can emotionally relate to it, understand the situation, get a grasp of it, and not have like emotional triggers. Because we're not talking about like diversity issues in your day-to-day life, but you're talking about aliens. So that makes it a little easier and a little more palatable because, you know, it's not your direct experience or what your grandfather yelled at you when you were a kid. It's something bigger and easier to relate to and say, oh, it brings clarity to what's right and what's wrong and what's ethical and what's not. And I think that that's a very interesting book and an interesting concept. And so I took that and I was like, how do we do this? Like the ethics of sci-fi and broaden the scope and say, how do we bring in movies, TV shows, other, you know, external stories that people can relate to, can see it tangibly, understand it, and digest it and say, that is this ethical theory. Like, let's explain this ethical theory in the confines of this story. And now people are going, oh, that's great, right? So anyways, I had a lot of fun doing that presentation. I hope that I can turn it into something more holistic that would qualify for, you know, CPA, CPE, because there are a lot of requirements that include talking about independence, which is not the most fun thing in the world, but maybe I could find a sci-fi show that brought that down to earth so people could understand it.
I feel like there's got to be some scenes that challenge those independence issues as far as the planets of where everybody's from and some sort of scenario. But you know, I think all of that makes awesome sense. And when I think about the ethics training for CPAs, my assumption has been that is based on the ethical framework of the CPA license. So it is like somewhat of a defined set of values, such as independence, that are being taught, which maybe that's kind of part of the challenge is it's not necessarily talking about the philosophy of ethics or those things. And you're absolutely right. I think I just read Right Thing, Right Now from Ryan Holiday, which is the Stoic philosophy perspective of ethics and justice. And it's an incredible book that really brought it home for me. But applying that to the ethical standards of the CPA, I'm not sure that bridge exists. Like, I think that there's definitely alignment in things and there's overlap, but I don't know if it checks all the boxes for like to qualify for CPA ethics.
You're making me really curious. Like, did you just take Maryland ethics and maybe if that's required? Maryland is one of the ones that's required to cover independence. Because I don't think I've attended a purely independence focused one in quite a while now. And when you look at the way that we approach ethics from the profession standpoint, because there actually is the IASBA, International Ethics Standards Board,
Okay.
I think, that really establishes the ethical framework or ethical standards throughout for the entire accounting profession internationally. That the approach to ethics there really comes back to how do we how are we maintaining the integrity? And our profession is number one for ethics. That's what we're known for, right? We're the number one trusted profession in the world, more than doctors, more than lawyers, more than any other professional. We're the trusted profession, and it's because we uphold ethics to this higher standard. And it's not just the independence, but it's really how are we ensuring that we are upholding our fiduciary duties back to the client, whether it be independence or objectivity. And with independence, it's to the public, right? With objectivity, it's back to the client. And the way that it approaches it is, what are the things that can threaten the way that we are either providing our advice or the recommendations that we're making, and how do we actually combat those so that we can still be more objective, maybe than less objective, might be the way to think about it. And a good example of that is I do a course on ethics of emerging technologies. So as we start to use artificial intelligence, as we start to do data analytics, right? How does that use of technology potentially impact our decision making? And one of the threats to that is the automation. It's actually an intimidation threat. So the intimidation threat is someone that doesn't understand the technology goes, well, the computer figured it out. It must be right. It has to be right. The computer said so, and computers don't make mistakes, right? And so or I don't understand it. Actually, sorry, intimidation is I don't understand it. And so it's right. And you see it with a lot of older people, especially, where they're like, oh, I'm scared of this thing, but it said it, so I'm going to believe it.
Yeah, I mean, and the Maryland ethics requirements, I mean, it's not 4 hours of independence training. I mean, I can tell you some of the trainers have tried to bring in, recent events. I remember one, we talked probably for 2 hours about Ja Rule and the fire the fire festival that was a big failure. But that again was one of those things where I walked away. I was like, yeah, it was a scam. Like they cheated people out of money. Like this is the easy ethics conversation. And I think what you're talking about is exactly the challenge that maybe I run into, and Liz, you referred to this earlier also, as far as like your personal morals and ethics, and our commitment, let's say, to the license and to the public. And I think about taxes is a really good example. I think there's probably places where you could say certain tax strategies, some people would probably argue are not ethical, and other people would argue. And then there would be that rule of whether or not it's allowed or permitted based on the rules. And just because it's permitted based on the rules doesn't necessarily mean that it's ethical. So, I maybe that's where we need to like really spend some time on building that framework of how to define what is ethical, especially in a traditional place where many accountants participate in the profession.
Yeah. Just an aside, there's supposed to be a new fire festival in December of 2024. Just
Oh yeah.
putting that out there, because I don't know if this is a fraud too, or if anyone will actually attend. But I think it would be interesting what happens out of that, because if it does turn out to be a fraud and the people actively buy tickets knowing that these people defrauded a bunch and were convicted of it and admitted it and all the things happen and they still put money into, like, does that become like, where are the ethics there? Is that
is it ethical if you're stealing from people that are that dumb? Is that
well, I mean, it's like if you are purposefully buying something that you know was consumer fraud, then is it, whose responsibility is it to say yes or no, right? Like, I don't know. I think it becomes like a very interesting question. And
like
also
4
no,
hours of training coming.
It is never ethical to defraud people. I want to put that baseline. I believe that. I know that. I just think it's funny. But yeah, no, I think it's very, very interesting. And the other side of it that I think unfortunately doesn't get conveyed is we talk about situations, we talk about, scenarios, we have these conversations in these ethics trainings that are great from the perspective of like, we're trying to do tangible learning, right? We are trying very hard, but we're also not relating it back to the underlying philosophy. So people end up with this like undefined sense of what the ethical code should be. And I say that because words have power. Like there have been studies done about how people understand things better when they have a definition for it and they have a word for it. And if you don't have a word for it, like there's colors of blue that we can't see because we don't have words for them, but other cultures do. And their eyeballs are not different. Their brains are not different, but they were raised with words for different segments of these colors. So they see them as adults and we can't. And I think that it's really fascinating that even though we know this, like scientifically proven, we know that having words and having language around different things makes you retain it and makes you see it and perceive it and understand it in a completely different way from internally in your brain, scientifically known. We still don't use that in practice. Like, what? So what I'm saying is we need to relate all these scenarios back into the philosophical theories and define them in a way that people can connect to it, understand it, have words for it, so they can see it in the future and make better decisions. And it's not just, oh, if this scenario happens to me, I know exactly what to do. It's I understand the framework of all scenarios that could potentially be similar to this one and others. And now I can make the right decision. And I think, to Donny's point, like we are an incredibly ethical profession because we talk about it, right? We're talking about ethics all the time, and we're making sure people know that they need to be ethical and that this is like foundationally important to all of us, right? But we need more. We need more definition. We need better understanding around the definitions and the theories. And we need people to start talking about it in a more interesting and more connective way and a less like ethics is important way.
The whole concept of this whole discussion on definition, I mean, it does really make me think now that this is why IASBA and then the promulgation at the individual country levels is important, because you can see that. I mean, it's in our AICPA code of conduct, and there's a whole separate section that's just on ethics, right? Because it's defining kind of not just the rules, but some of the philosophy behind what's happening there. To draw that a little closer in back to what Byron said, I think that's also why when I'm looking at organizations, I like to see the code of conduct and the words that describe what their values, not just the code of conduct, but their values, and then the words that describe what the values mean. Because we've been finding that too, even in my firm, that we have a definition of each of our values, and even then we're taking that even further and having to go through exercises to discuss, well, what does on time mean? Even something like that. Not talking about showing up for work, but like when we talk about a project is on time, what is actually on time?
Yeah, and that's one of those exercises that a lot of organizations go through when they're defining their values and then trying to create definitions or behaviors that represent those values. And I always find it funny though, because so many organizations, their like top two values are like integrity, trust. And then there's always that debate as to whether like, do you have to have that as a defined value, or should we, can we assume that we're all good people and we're just like, we don't have to say our number one value is integrity? Does Donny, is integrity one of the values?
Actually, it's funny you say that, because integrity and trust are both two of the values that we have.
Yeah. So you are saying that it needs to be explicitly defined there.
Yeah, because what we found, and I think this is especially so in accounting, there's a nuance to the word integrity. Sure. Right? The standing behind what you say, having integrity behind what you say. So we've actually had to talk about that more. Part of that, for example, standing behind what you say, is we're like, you don't just shoot from, because we're giving advice to clients, you don't just shoot from the hip from on whatever. There needs to be a basis behind what you're saying or why you're advising on a particular position. And then trust, we've actually taking it in several different ways. For example, one of the ways we talk about trust is we trust people to fulfill their roles, which is, if you're HR, I trust that you're going to do the job of HR, or as the firm's management, the staff entrusts us to make the decisions that are best for the firm as a whole. And this is coming back to that sort of objectivity, right? Rather than just ourselves. So we actually describe it and we talk about how ethics actually and the values actually all integrate and work together to allow us to actually work together.
And what ethical theory is that?
I don't know, that's ours. I thought it was interesting. Brian brought up Stoicism, he brought Machiavellianism. I've become a kind of a fan of Kant and a bunch of his stuff.
Well, right. That would be like Kantianism, right?
Yeah.
And understanding that's like the philosophy of like doing what's right in the moment, right? So it's like the belief system that if you are motivated by the right things and you are capable and in the right position, if we're talking professionally, that you will do the right thing, right? That's that ethical theory, which is different than some other ethical theories, right? Like you have utilitarianism, which is the theory that the outcome is what matters most. So I don't want to hurt people. So I'm going to pick the thing that has the least amount of hurt at the end. But that ignores like what happens today and the situations you might be in where, the getting there might violate some other ethical theories, right? And so it's like understanding the professional ethics, understanding the theories, understanding like how they interplay, and also like that you don't have to pick one and stick to it for your whole life is something else that's really important. But it gives you like a framework to really analyze a situation. And then there's also like values-based ethics, which is saying like if you are morally sound and you're making decisions based on these set of values, then they're ethical. And I disagree with a lot of that because we've seen what happens with that in the medical profession. And so sometimes utilitarianism matters, right? Because thinking about it from a different perspective is important. And so, I think like one of the things that I find really fascinating is in pop culture and in specifically in sci-fi, there have been like a few phrases, right? Or like quotes that have come out that have been like very impactful. And I think one of them was Spock saying the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few or the one, right? And that was, in the Wrath of Khan, and when he goes in and basically sacrifices himself because the warp core is exploding and there's all sorts of theatrical stuff happening. But that quote is so famous and so meaningful. And a lot of people think about that from like an ethical perspective, but that viewpoint is utilitarianism in its form. And it's a form of consequentialism because consequentialism considers what the consequence is, right? To make the decision, which is also very Machiavellian, which is what I brought up. But it is an example of an ethical theory playing out in a very dramatic way and having somebody make a decision based off of that. Now that violates values. I do not believe self-sacrifice is a value or a virtue that if you're looking at like value-based ethics or virtue-based ethics would play out. Like that would be unethical in that situation, right? But it's based on the outcome. So I bring that up to say that there are multiple ways to think about any situation. And when you start digging into it professionally, there's a lot that can come from just understanding and having definitions around what these things mean.
And that actually, you brought that kind of full circle because when you just started saying self-sacrifice, that makes me think of the kamikaze bombers. I've also been watching Vikings Valhalla, and I'm thinking that's also part of the Viking. I mean, that's why people would give themselves up for sacrifice, right? Was I will allow you to kill me as a sacrifice to help bless our raid or whatever they were doing. Looking at it from a positive, it can also play on the negative side on the self-sacrifice where we see the what is it, the jihadi kind of like bomber where they go and kill the community and things. So we can see that play out both in a positive and a negative depending upon the cultural context. Oof.
And we can see it play out professionally. I mean, how many firms do you know that have cultures of self-sacrifice? Is that ethical? Does the outcome of this work getting done on time, however we choose to define on time, mean that you can abuse people and force them to work 90-hour weeks? Is that ethical?
I think all of us would agree no on that one.
Right. But in a consequentialism or a utilitarianism perspective, it is, because the outcome is all that matters. But I don't think that that's ethical. And I think, that goes back to, Kantianism and like understanding that every single day and every single decision matters, right? So,
Well,
anyways, demonstrating why ethical theories and philosophies and understanding definitions and when they play out like positively or negatively is very important to this conversation, and unfortunately not talked about enough.
oh, I think about the challenges that we are facing right now as a profession, as far as pipeline, people coming into the profession, people leaving the profession. And it makes me wonder, based on this conversation, if this doesn't boil down to a lack of ethical guidance with respect to how we treat our people and how we take care of our people, right? Because that's a lot of the conversation around how much people are worked, how much people are valued, how much people are paid. And I hadn't thought about that being an ethical consideration, but I do wonder if that's maybe a gap right now in the ethical framework of our profession that needs to be filled to potentially address some of the challenges we're facing.
And I would argue it is a gap, and it is a gap because the way ethics is presented is only in decision making for our professional work, not in decision making for operational or human issues. And we're not discussing these theories in a broader perspective. We are very hyper focused on, from a money perspective, if you do this, it causes this, right? And that's wonderful. It's great to have those conversations. And we also need more, and we need higher level discussions and more philosophical discussions. And we need to talk about it in ways people can relate to and have conversations that are real and think about this from, a philosophical framework.
No, Byron, did this discussion make this more real for you and less black and white?
I mean, I think this conversation has been really fascinating. It certainly opened my perspective to the many facets of ethics and education that needs to happen around ethics. I think it has certainly highlighted kind of what we all felt coming into this conversation, that the current conversations with respect to ethics in our profession are not only are the conversations stale, but potentially the frameworks that are influencing those conversations stale and need to be revived and refreshed. So, I've got a lot to chew on from this conversation, and I thank you both. It's been really good.
But also, I would make one adjustment to what you said. I don't know that the frameworks are necessarily stale so much as they need to be expanded, and that's kind of what I'm hearing Liz say too. We need to take it and broaden that discussion and the applicability, because what we have works for what we do, which is primarily, as Liz said, client focused. We need to take that, and almost the whole cobbler's children thing, we need to take that and apply that back into ourselves. And then it broaden the context and the way that we talk about this beyond just helping clients make those decisions.
It's kind of one-dimensional.
Yeah.
Yes, that's a very good way to put it. And I also think that is happening. It's just happening in like micro areas, right? Like the DEI that's been, working its way through every corporate industry because it's needed and quite frankly overdue. That is an ethical consideration, right? And in that, microcosm of change that's happening, there are a lot of ethical things that are talked about and worked through and given context to people. But that's one specific area, right? And so, yes, I agree with you, Donny. It needs to be broadened and discussed at a higher level and not just micro focused on specific external things.
Well, and actually, since you brought that up, that just made me think even too, there's all this question about on ESG, environmental, social, governance reporting, and whether ESG itself, or especially the environmental part, which is the focus right now, because social will align to DEI, it is environmental, and the things that we're trying to do in environmental, is that really ethical? And or if a company ignores their carbon impacts and other environmental impacts, is that actually ethical or not? So many different ways that this will actually play out. Right. We're gonna get into a whole nother podcast again. So we better end here and just say to be continued, perhaps.
Thanks for tuning in.
Thanks everyone for joining us. We'll hope to see you in another episode of Accounting Arc.
Thanks, guys.
The Center for Accounting Transformation provides business professionals with a network for utilizing innovations that are ready for adoption, the training and resources necessary to apply those innovations, and an opportunity to engage the talent and community needed to further the pursuit of innovative accounting practices that drive responsible and mindful business performance. Find out more at our website, www.improvetheworld.net. And if you're interested in sharing your own transformation stories, please contact us there.